Celia Harroway had spent her entire life being overlooked, which was why the moment the Duke of Ravencourt's gaze locked onto hers, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, she felt the ground shift beneath her, as if fate itself had finally decided she was no longer allowed to disappear. She had expected nothing from this winter gathering at Blackthorn Hall, arriving only because her family needed a presence at the Duke's annual affair. Yet the instant she crossed the threshold into the great ballroom, a shiver curled up her spine and whispered that nothing about this night would remain ordinary. The hall glittered beneath cascades of crystal chandeliers, the air thick with perfume and whispered speculation, but she felt none of its warmth, for the Duke stood at the far end of the room, tall, immovable, carved from shadow and scandal, watching her with an intensity that unsettled the very breath in her lungs. Guests parted around him instinctively, as though proximity alone might draw them into the dark legends that had shaped his reputation, yet Celia found herself unable to look away, caught between fear and a strange, treacherous pull she did not understand. She tried to retreat behind her cousin Verena and the other glittering guests, telling herself the Duke could not possibly be looking at her, but his gaze followed her like the sweep of a winter wind across frozen glass, cool, consuming, deliberate. For a moment she wondered if she had somehow offended him simply by existing in his line of sight, but then his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, softening from scrutiny into something more unreadable, something that felt like recognition, though of what, she could not imagine. Her heart pounded with a force she had never felt, not even in the cruelest moments of her past when humiliation had wrapped itself around her like a second skin, and as she forced herself to look away, she realized her hands were trembling. She had come to this place resigned to being nothing more than a silent guest, a shadow passing unnoticed through the grand halls of nobility, yet the Duke's unyielding focus pierced through that invisibility with startling ease, leaving her exposed in ways she was wholly unprepared for. And as the orchestra swelled and conversations resumed around her, Celia understood one truth with clarity that stole her breath. Whatever quiet life she had expected to endure would not survive the night, not with the Duke watching her as though she were the first unexpected thing to cross his path in years. Celia tried to steady her breathing as the ballroom's golden glow pressed in on her, but the Duke's stare lingered in her mind long after he turned away, leaving her pulse fluttering like a trapped wren beneath her ribs. She told herself she was being foolish, that his attention meant nothing, that a man of his stature had no reason to notice a quiet, forgettable woman whose family clung desperately to the last threads of dignity, yet her thoughts betrayed her as she drifted toward the far end of the room where laughter and whispers collected like frost along the walls. It was there she overheard the first cruel murmurs, two women wrapped in silk and false charm speaking with the bored delight of those who have never feared consequences. They said the Duke was dangerous, that he carried the memory of his late wife like a curse, that any woman who drew too near risked becoming the next tragic name in a lineage stained with misfortune. Celia stiffened, wanting to slip away before their words seeped any deeper, but one voice sharpened, claiming the Duke possessed a coldness that could freeze a woman from the inside out. Another added that he trusted no one, loved no one, and tolerated even less. Celia exhaled shakily, her fear swelling into something heavy and unsteady in her chest, yet the strangest sensation crept alongside it, an ache that felt suspiciously like sympathy, as though she sensed sorrow beneath the harsh stories. When she finally turned to leave, she collided softly with a wall of dark fabric and unyielding presence, and her breath caught sharply as she realized it was him. The Duke stood too close, his expression unreadable, his eyes flicking to the whispering women before returning to her with a quiet, penetrating intensity that made her spine straighten instinctively. "Is there something you wish to hear?" he asked, his voice low and smooth like shadowed marble, "or something you wish to believe?" Celia opened her mouth, but no explanation formed. Fear and embarrassment tangled her thoughts hopelessly. Yet the Duke did not chastise her, nor did he appear offended. Instead, he studied her with a strange, unsettling patience, as though trying to decide whether she was like the countless others who flinched at the sound of his name, or if she might be capable of seeing beyond the cold myths he wore like armor. In that suspended moment, Celia felt the balance of her world shift once more, not because he frightened her, but because some quiet part of her feared she might already care what he thought. Celia spent the remainder of the evening attempting to melt back into obscurity, but her composure unraveled each time she sensed the Duke somewhere in the room, his presence a quiet force that altered the air around him as surely as a storm alters the sky. She kept her eyes lowered, willing herself to fade into the glittering sea of guests, but the memory of his question, soft, pointed, impossible to ignore, echoed through her like an unanswered chord. When the footman announced dinner, she took her place among the guests with a resigned calm, prepared for nothing more than polite conversation and the usual indifference she received from society. Yet, as the first course was served, the Duke rose from his seat at the head of the table, and a hush swept through the hall as though the candles themselves leaned in to listen. His gaze traveled slowly down the length of the table until it reached her, holding her captive even before he spoke her name in a voice that carried with effortless authority. He requested her company the following morning for a private tour of Blackthorn Hall, phrasing the invitation with a courtesy so formal it left no room for refusal. Yet the subtle warmth beneath the words made her pulse falter. A murmur rippled among the guests. Disbelief, envy, and speculation swirled as Verena stiffened beside her, her smile tightening into something brittle and poisonous. Celia, stunned into breathless silence, felt every eye on her as she nodded carefully, unable to comprehend why a man of his stature and shadowed reputation would choose her for anything at all. When she dared glance toward him again, she found not triumph nor flirtation in his expression, but a steady, assessing calm, as if he were searching for something within her he had not yet named. Throughout the rest of dinner, she tasted nothing, heard nothing. Her thoughts spun with questions she had no hope of answering. Why her? What could he possibly want from a woman who possessed neither beauty nor influence? Only a gentle voice and a history of being overlooked. Yet beneath her anxiety lurked a strange, unwelcome curiosity that refused to be silenced, as though part of her sensed that the Duke's invitation was not simply an act of formality, but the pull of a thread tying itself between them. And as the evening faded into candlelight and murmured farewells, Celia found herself unable to escape the uneasy truth taking root within her. Whatever the Duke sought in her, whatever purpose lay behind his unexpected request, tomorrow would draw her deeper into his world, and she no longer knew whether she wished to resist or surrender to the path unfolding before her. Celia scarcely slept that night, her thoughts restless as snow drifting along the window panes, and when morning came, she felt both unprepared and strangely compelled as she made her way through the silent corridors of Blackthorn Hall toward the appointed meeting place. The Duke awaited her near the grand staircase, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, every line of his posture controlled with the kind of calm that made her feel suddenly transparent beneath his gaze. Without offering more than a polite greeting, he began the tour, guiding her through ancient hallways lined with paintings of past dukes whose stern expressions seemed carved from the same stone that shaped Alistair's reputation. Celia listened quietly as he spoke of the estate's history with a depth of knowledge that surprised her, for beneath his reserved demeanor lay a man profoundly tethered to his lineage. Yet the deeper they walked into the manor, the more she sensed an undercurrent of tension threading through his voice, as though certain rooms carried echoes he would rather silence than confront. When they reached a long, dimly lit gallery, Celia felt the temperature shift, the air growing heavy with a quiet that seemed too deliberate. There, against the far wall, stood a tall portrait draped with a dark velvet cloth, not dusty from neglect, but freshly placed, as though intentionally concealed. She paused before it, drawn by an intuition she could not explain, and the Duke's steps faltered behind her, the first true crack in his composure she had ever witnessed. His jaw tightened, his breath, barely audible, caught like a man bracing for a blow. "This wing is seldom used," he said, the brittle edge in his tone betraying far more than the words themselves. Celia turned toward him gently, sensing the pain pulsing beneath his restraint, but he avoided her eyes, staring instead at the veiled painting as though its presence were a weight he had carried too long. She felt her fear soften into something unexpected, empathy, quiet and aching, as she realized the rumors whispered throughout the ballroom had never touched upon the depth of the Duke's grief. Without questioning further, she stepped back, granting him the distance he clearly needed, yet she knew the moment would linger between them like a secret neither dared name. And though he resumed the tour with practiced calm, Celia walked beside him with a new understanding thrumming through her. The man society feared was not the monster they painted, but a soul shaped by loss so profound it left shadows even the brightest chandeliers could not banish. Celia entered the evening gathering with a cautious heart, intending to keep herself tucked safely at the room's edge where she could observe without inviting attention. Yet the moment she stepped inside, a subtle shift in the air warned her that the night had already chosen a different fate for her. Soft music drifted through the ballroom, the violins weaving a delicate thread of sound that shimmered over the assembled guests. But Celia felt disconnected from the festivities, her thoughts still lingering on the veiled portrait and the sorrow she sensed beneath the Duke's controlled exterior. She attempted to occupy herself with conversation, though her responses came faint and distracted, and Verina's sharp glances only tightened the unease coiling in her chest. She was certain the Duke would not approach her after the tension of the morning, certain he would withdraw into the inscrutable silence that shielded him from the world. And yet, as the orchestra shifted into a waltz, she felt the unmistakable weight of his gaze settling on her once more. The room seemed to still around her as the Duke crossed the distance with measured precision, his presence causing conversations to falter as he paused before her and extended a gloved hand, his expression unreadable yet undeniably intent. Celia's breath caught, her pulse quickening as she realized what he was asking of her, and though uncertainty fluttered through her, she placed her hand in his with a trembling courage she did not know she possessed. As he guided her onto the floor, the warmth of his touch spread through her like a quiet flame, and the world beyond their joined hands blurred into insignificance. Their movements aligned with surprising ease, her steps drawn into the steady strength of his, and as the waltz carried them in sweeping arcs across the polished floor, Celia felt a peculiar sense of being seen, not simply noticed, but genuinely perceived in a way she never had been. Whispers rose around them, brittle and envious, but the Duke's focus never wavered. His gaze held hers with an intensity that left her dizzy, as though he were studying every fleeting emotion that crossed her face. She wondered if he sensed the fear, the curiosity, the fragile pull that had taken root within her, for his hold tightened subtly, reassuring her with a steadiness she had not expected. When the final notes of the waltz faded, and he released her hand with deliberate care, Celia felt the absence of his touch like a sudden chill, and as he inclined his head in a gesture both formal and intimate, she understood with startling clarity that whatever bond was forming between them, however fragile and uncertain, had deepened irrevocably in that stolen dance. Celia slipped out of the ballroom the moment the waltz ended, her breath still unsteady from the memory of the Duke's hand guiding hers, his silent intensity lingering upon her skin like an imprint she could not wash away. Yet she needed distance, just a moment, to gather herself before the weight of everyone's stares crushed whatever fragile courage she possessed. The corridor outside was dim and cool, lit only by a scattering of wall sconces whose glow softened the edges of her trembling thoughts. But she had barely taken 2 steps when Verina emerged from the shadows with the practiced grace of someone who thrived on perfectly timed entrances. Her cousin's smile was sweetened with venom, her eyes glittering with triumph at having intercepted Celia alone. "You should be careful," Verina murmured, drawing closer as though offering sisterly concern, though her voice was laced with sharpened amusement. "The Duke may appear to favor you now, but he has a way of ruining the women foolish enough to mistake his attention for something real. Ask anyone who remembers his poor wife. Oh, but perhaps he prefers you ignorant." Celia stiffened, her hands curling involuntarily at her sides as Verina leaned in, her whisper a hiss meant to coil around Celia's heart. She spoke of shadows in Alistair's past, of whispered cruelty and a coldness said to hollow out any woman who tried to warm him. Celia felt each word sink like ice into her chest, stirring fears she had tried to silence since the moment she first met him. Verina's expression softened into feigned sympathy. "You are too fragile for a man like him, my dear. Better to retreat now, before he decides you are no longer worth the trouble." The corridor seemed to tilt, narrowing around Celia as doubt surged painfully through her, clouding the fragile wonder she had allowed herself to feel during their dance. She wanted to protest, to deny Verina's insinuations, but the cruel certainty in her cousin's tone stole her voice. When footsteps approached from the far end of the hall, Verina straightened instantly, arranging her features into flawless innocence before gliding away. Celia remained frozen until she saw the Duke himself emerging from the shadowed corridor, his gaze instantly sharpening as it landed on her. Something in her posture, perhaps the tremor of uncertainty she could not hide, made his expression darken with a quiet, unreadable tension. He paused before her, searching her face with unsettling accuracy, as though he could sense the disturbance Verina had left in her wake. Celia tore her eyes away, fear and confusion twisting within her, and in that small, faltering movement she felt him withdraw just slightly, as though her sudden distance wounded him more than if she had spoken the cruel rumors aloud. Celia spent the next morning avoiding the east wing entirely, hoping the lingering tremor in her chest would settle if she kept herself far from the Duke's piercing gaze. Yet fate, or perhaps folly, intervened when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with him in a narrow sunlit passage, the proximity so abrupt her breath fractured in her throat. Alistair halted at once, his expression initially neutral, but as his eyes scanned her pale face and the tightness in her posture, a flicker of something sharp crossed his features. "You have been avoiding me," he said, not accusatory, yet heavy with restrained tension. Celia tried to muster a polite denial, but Verena's warnings clawed through her memory, souring her voice with fear she had not intended to reveal. "I thought perhaps it would be safer if I kept my distance," she whispered, and the moment the trembling words escaped her, she wished desperately to recall them, for the Duke's expression shifted in a way she had never seen, his jaw tightening, his posture stiffening as though she had struck a wound hidden beneath steel. "Safer," he repeated, the single word tasting of bitterness and disbelief. "Is that truly what you believe of me?" Celia stepped back instinctively, her anxiety spiraling as she struggled to find the right explanation, and in her flustered panic she stammered something about reputation, about whispers, about not wanting to become another cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. It was the wrong thing, painfully, unforgivably wrong. A dark, wounded fury ignited in his eyes, not the rage of a tyrant, but the anguish of a man who had hoped for gentleness, and instead received suspicion. "I did not take you for someone who listens to gossip like a frightened child," he said quietly, but the quietness was worse than a shout, carrying an edge so raw it cut through her like ice. Celia's heart wrenched at the accusation, for she had not meant to insult him. She had only meant to protect herself from the confusion unraveling her composure. But her silence, trembling and uncertain, seemed only to confirm his worst fears. He turned away sharply, breath drawn tight, as though containing emotions he refused to let spill in her presence. "If you fear me," he said, voice clipped and pained, "then perhaps this charade should end." His footsteps echoed down the corridor before she could gather the courage to call him back, leaving her alone with the crushing realization that she had wounded him far more deeply than any rumor ever could. As she pressed trembling fingers to her lips, Celia felt the weight of the moment settle heavily upon her. She feared not the Duke, but the possibility that her careless words had fractured something fragile and precious, something she had only just begun to understand. The storm arrived without warning, rolling across the moors with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to echo the tempest that had taken root within Celia's chest. By late afternoon, Blackthorn Hall rattled beneath the assault of wind and ice, the windows shuddering as snow roared against them in furious sheets. Guests hurried through corridors seeking warmth and company, but Celia, unsettled by the rift with the Duke and desperate for space to breathe, wandered deeper into the west wing where only silence greeted her. The lamps flickered restlessly as she moved through the dim corridor, her thoughts spiraling with the memory of Alistair's wounded expression, each step heavy with regret she had no idea how to mend. A sudden groan of old timber startled her. Before she could retreat, the unstable floor beneath her shifted sharply, causing her ankle to twist beneath her weight. Pain snapped through her, sending her collapsing against the wall as she tried, and failed, to steady herself. The hall stretched before her in eerie quiet, every gust of wind rattling the windows like a warning she should never have come this far alone. Panic threatened to rise, cold and choking, but before fear could fully consume her, heavy footsteps broke through the storm's distant roar. A tall shadow appeared at the corridor's end, moving with urgency, and Celia felt a dizzy rush of disbelief as the Duke emerged from the gloom, breath ragged, cloak whipped by the draught as though he had been searching frantically. His gaze swept over her with a force that made her chest tighten, and without hesitation he knelt beside her, his hands, steady despite the tension bracing his features, lifting her gently into his arms. "You should not be here," he murmured, but the reprimand carried no anger, only relief threaded with fear. Celia swallowed hard, unable to speak past the aching mix of guilt and unexpected solace flooding through her as he held her close, her cheek brushing against the warmth of his shoulder. The storm outside raged violently, but within his embrace she felt an impossible steadiness, as though she had stepped into the calm heart of the gale. Alistair carried her down the corridor with determined strides, refusing to let the servants intervene when they rushed forward, his hold tightening protectively each time the manor shuddered beneath another gust. Celia felt the world blur around them, the flicker of torches, the distant echo of panicked voices, until all she could register was the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, and the dawning realization that whatever fear she once held of him had dissolved entirely in the face of this quiet, undeniable tenderness. Celia scarcely remembered the path the Duke took as he carried her through the storm, battered corridors, for her senses were fixed entirely on the warmth of his arms and the quiet intensity of his breathing, as though each inhale steadied some part of her unraveling composure. When they reached the small sitting room near the hearth, he lowered her onto the velvet chaise with a care so deliberate it stole the breath from her lungs. The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow that softened the severity of his features, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, his eyes darkened with an emotion she could not decipher. Then, without a word, he knelt before her and reached for her injured ankle, his gloved fingers pausing only when she flinched. "Forgive me," he murmured, removing the glove with a measured grace that revealed the bare, startling gentleness of his touch. Celia's pulse fluttered as he examined the swelling, his brow furrowing with concern that felt almost too intimate to bear. She tried to speak, to apologize for her foolish wandering, but the words tangled helplessly in her throat. The Duke, however, seemed already aware of the storm inside her. "You were frightened," he said quietly, not accusing but acknowledging, as though naming the truth might ease its weight. Celia lowered her gaze, ashamed that her retreat had hurt him so deeply, yet unable to deny the fragile fear that had driven her away. His fingertips brushed lightly along her ankle, soothing rather than probing, and the tenderness in that single gesture unraveled the last threads of her resistance. "I had no right to lash out," he continued, his voice low, edged with remorse. "You owe me neither certainty nor trust, but I reacted poorly to the thought of losing your regard." The confession struck her with unexpected force. She lifted her gaze to him, finding not the fearsome figure of rumor, but a man struggling beneath the weight of emotions he barely understood. The firelight played across his features, revealing the exhaustion etched into every controlled line of his face, and Celia felt something shift within her, a quiet, dangerous longing to soothe the shadows that haunted him. "You did not lose it," she whispered, the truth trembling out before she could consider its implications. His hand stilled, his breath catching faintly at her admission. For a moment neither spoke, their silence thick with unspoken questions and the fragile possibility dawning between them. Then, with a steadiness that belied the storm raging outside, the Duke wrapped her ankle gently and rose to his feet, though his gaze lingered on her with a softness she had never imagined he possessed. In that tender stillness, Celia realized she no longer feared him at all. What she feared now was how deeply she might already care, and as the flames wavered across the room, she sensed that this moment marked the beginning of a truth neither could yet fully name or claim. Celia awoke the next morning with her ankle bound neatly in linen, the memory of the Duke's gentle touch still lingering like warmth beneath the bandage, and though the storm outside had quieted into a soft drifting of snow, her thoughts churned with a restlessness she could neither name nor steady. She moved carefully through the manor, determined to avoid him until she could make sense of the tumult stirring inside her, but a footman intercepted her before she reached the breakfast room, informing her in a tone that brooked no refusal that His Grace requested her presence in the study. Her heart lurched, anxiety and anticipation colliding as she made her way toward the heavy oak door. When she stepped inside, the Duke stood beside the window, hands clasped behind his back, the pale morning light casting a silver edge along his dark hair. He turned as she entered, his gaze sweeping over her bandaged ankle with unmistakable concern before settling on her face with a gravity that made her pulse quicken. "Lady Celia," he began, his voice controlled yet edged with something more vulnerable than she had ever heard from him, "there is a matter we must discuss." He motioned for her to sit, but remained standing, as though the confession he was about to deliver demanded distance. "Your family's circumstances are precarious," he continued, and the way he softened the word told her he understood far more than he admitted. Celia stiffened, shame prickling beneath her skin, for she had hoped to keep her family's quiet ruin from reaching his ears. But he did not wield the knowledge as weapon or leverage. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression gentling. "I can secure their future," he said, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. "I can erase the debts, restore what your father has lost, and ensure you are never placed in a position where society might scorn or disregard you again." Celia's breath halted, confusion and disbelief flooding her as she waited for the cruel condition such an offer usually carried. When it came, it was nothing she expected. "In return," he said quietly, "I ask only that you remain at Blackthorn Hall for the duration of the winter season, as my personal companion, not in servitude but in trust." The word trust trembled through her, striking a place within her she had guarded fiercely all her life. She stared at him, her heart pounding, torn between the fear of binding herself to a man she barely understood and the deeper, more dangerous fear of what it meant that she wanted to say yes. A silence stretched, heavy with unsaid truths, until finally Celia drew a breath, feeling the tremor of her choice settle in her bones. "If it will aid my family," she whispered, "then, yes, Your Grace." His exhale was quiet, shaky, almost relieved, and in that single sound she understood that their fates had just intertwined in ways neither could undo. The announcement of Celia's new position within Blackthorn Hall spread through the household with the quiet, piercing efficiency of winter wind slipping beneath a door, and by midday every servant, every guest, every opportunistic whisperer seemed to know she had accepted the Duke's offer to remain for the season. Though no formal declaration had been made, her presence beside His Grace as he oversaw small matters of the estate, and the subtle, protective way he adjusted his pace to match her injured stride, spoke loudly enough. The servants' reactions were the first she felt, their glances a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Some offered shy, respectful nods, as though recognizing the Duke's attention marked her as someone beyond the ranks of visiting nobility, while others watched warily, measuring her against the memory of the Duchess whose portrait remained veiled in the West Wing. But it was the guests whose scrutiny cut deepest. They observed her with the sharp, glittering hunger of ballroom predators, scenting scandal. Lady Rowena, once confidant to the late Duchess, eyed Celia with open disdain each time their paths crossed, her lips curved in a brittle smile that suggested Celia tread upon sacred ground she had no right to claim. Even Verena, draped elegantly at luncheon, allowed herself a soft, triumphant scoff whenever someone mentioned Celia's name, as though she believed the entire arrangement nothing more than a pitiful embarrassment waiting to unfold. Celia bore their reactions with as much composure as she could muster, but the weight of their judgment pressed hard upon her ribs, threatening to crack the fragile steadiness she had fought to reclaim. Yet what unsettled her most was not the whispering, nor the envy, nor the outright scorn. It was the Duke's unwavering, silent vigilance. Whenever she faltered beneath the sting of another cutting remark, he seemed to appear at her side with that quiet, commanding presence that hushed a room without a single word. He offered no reassurances, no gentle platitudes, only a steadiness that felt far more powerful than spoken comfort could ever be. And every time his gaze brushed hers in a silent acknowledgement of the battle she endured, Celia felt something warm unfurl inside her, something she feared would root too deeply if she allowed it. But even that fragile warmth could not fully quiet the doubts that rose like unwelcome shadows. Was she truly helping her family, or was she stepping into a role she was doomed to fail? Could she survive the scrutiny of a household still haunted by the Duchess's memory? She did not know. Yet as the afternoon waned and the last of the guests murmured their speculations over tea, she sensed Alistair's gaze lingering on her once more, not assessing, not demanding, but quietly assuring. And though she tried to steady her breath, she felt the truth settle into her heart with disarming clarity. Whatever storm this new position invited, she would not be weathering it entirely alone. Celia had hoped that exhaustion might grant her a few hours of peaceful sleep, but as midnight deepened around Blackthorn Hall, she found herself roaming its lamplit corridors with a restlessness she could neither soothe nor understand, drawn by an invisible thread toward the one room where warmth still glowed behind a half-closed door. She hesitated at the threshold of the library, intending only to steady her nerves before retreating to her chamber. Yet the sight that met her unraveled every intention she had formed. The Duke stood alone by the fire, its flickering light cutting through the darkness to reveal the unmistakable strain etched across his features, shadows beneath his eyes, tension locked in the line of his shoulders, and a quiet, haunted look that made her breath catch. He had removed his coat and loosened his cravat, an uncharacteristic disarray that told her this moment belonged not to the formidable Duke of Ravencourt, but to the man who lived beneath the armor of that title. Before she could withdraw unnoticed, a quiet sound escaped him, a sharp inhale, pained and involuntary, and he pressed a hand to his temple, as though fighting off a memory too fierce to contain. Something inside Celia stirred, soft and instinctive, urging her forward even as uncertainty tugged her back. She crossed the room with slow, careful steps, her heart pounding as she whispered, "Your Grace?" The Duke jolted slightly, not in anger but in startled vulnerability, his eyes lifting to meet hers with a rawness she had never witnessed. "I did not mean to wake the household," he murmured, attempting to straighten his posture, but the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Celia approached the fire, keeping a respectful distance as she said softly, You seemed troubled." He gave a faint, humorless laugh, turning his gaze toward the flames. Troubled is a generous word for it. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not suffocating, and Celia felt herself drawn into the gravity of his solitude. She hesitated only a moment before placing a gentle hand on the back of the chair nearest him, grounding herself before the next step. "If speaking eases the weight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am here." The Duke's breath faltered, and when he finally looked at her, the wall he so carefully erected around his heart seemed to waver. "It has been years since someone offered me such a thing without expecting something in return," he said quietly, the confession carrying a brittle sincerity that tugged at the deepest part of her. Celia felt a rush of tenderness so fierce it frightened her, yet she did not retreat. Instead, she allowed her hand to rest lightly on his arm, offering warmth and steadiness with no expectation attached. His eyes fluttered closed at the contact, as though the simple touch reached a place he had long believed numb. In that fragile moment, surrounded by firelight and shadows, an unspoken truth settled between them. Their hearts had begun to lean toward one another, uncertain yet undeniable, drawn into a quiet bond that neither fully understood, but both already felt. Morning had scarcely broken when Celia sensed a shift in the atmosphere of Blackthorn Hall, a thin, taut tension that coiled through the corridors like smoke, carrying the unmistakable sourness of fresh scandal. She felt eyes follow her during breakfast, not with the curious glances she had grown accustomed to, but with sharp, judgmental scrutiny, as though every whisper that fluttered behind gloved hands bore her name. It was only when Lady Rowena, with her frost-edged smile, murmured something snide about ambition dressed in innocence, that Celia understood the rumors had not merely resurfaced, they had multiplied. By midday she found herself cornered near the staircase by a trio of ladies who spoke in syrupy tones that failed to hide their venom, implying she had manipulated the Duke, entrapped him, ensnared his grief for her gain. Celia attempted to retreat with dignity, but humiliation burned beneath her skin, tightening her throat until speech became impossible. And just when she believed the moment could not become more unbearable, her father arrived, his face red with a mixture of anger and mortification. "Celia," he hissed, pulling her aside with a grip too firm to be gentle, "have you disgraced our family? Have you allowed the Duke to compromise you?" The question struck her like a blow, her knees weakening beneath the weight of his accusation. She tried to explain, to assure him she had done nothing dishonorable, but her father, overwhelmed by the whispers echoing through the hall, refused to listen. His voice rose, echoing through the vast entryway, drawing the attention of every onlooker delighted by the spectacle of a family unraveling. Before Celia could gather the breath to defend herself, a quiet, commanding voice cut through the chaos with blade, like precision. "That is enough." The Duke stood at the base of the staircase, his presence radiating such cold authority that even the sneering guests fell into shocked silence. His gaze swept the crowd before landing on Celia's trembling form, and something fierce flickered in his eyes as he descended the steps with measured, unhurried strides. "Lady Celia has conducted herself with nothing but dignity," he said, his tone leaving no space for contradiction. "Any suggestion otherwise is a lie born of malice or envy." Gasps rippled through the hall as he positioned himself beside her, his arm shielding her from the predatory attention around them. Her father sputtered, unsure whether to bow or continue his reprimand, but the Duke's expression hardened with unmistakable warning. "You will not chastise her for the falsehoods of others," he said. "She is under my protection, by my own choosing." The declaration settled over the hall like a sudden snowfall, soft in tone, devastating in impact. Celia stood frozen, stunned by the magnitude of his defense, and as the crowd slowly dispersed under his silent command, she felt her pulse flutter wildly. The Duke had not just shielded her from scandal, he had claimed responsibility for her honor in a manner that made clear to everyone, including her, how deeply she mattered to him. In the hours following the Duke's public defense, Celia felt as though the very walls of Blackthorn Hall observed her with new, unblinking eyes, their silence thick with expectation she could not satisfy. Though the immediate sting of humiliation had faded, replaced by the strange, fluttering warmth of Alistair's unwavering protection, a different unease soon settled within her, one born not from the cruelty of others, but from the man whose presence had become both her solace and her storm. That evening, as she attempted to retire quietly to her chamber, she found the Duke waiting for her at the end of the corridor, his posture rigid with an authority sharper than any blade. He dismissed the servants with a single glance before stepping closer, the flicker of the candle sconces tracing the stern line of his jaw. "You will not speak to Hawthorne again," he said, his tone measured but iron-bound. "Nor will you be alone in the presence of any gentleman guest without my knowledge." Celia froze, the words striking her with a chill that seeped beneath the fragile bloom of gratitude in her chest. "Your Grace," she began cautiously, "I have no intention of seeking Hawthorne's company, but surely nothing," he interrupted, a shadow crossing his expression. "You are vulnerable to their malice, and I will not have you harmed." She flinched at the bluntness of his words, for though she understood his concern, the command felt like a tether tightening around her ribs. "I am grateful for your protection," she said softly, "but I cannot live as though I am a danger to myself. I have faced humiliation before, Alistair. I know how to endure it." His eyes darkened at her use of his name, but not with fury, with something wounded, almost pleading, quickly hidden beneath his usual restraint. "Endure it?" he repeated, voice low. "You should not have to endure anything." Celia's breath caught, her heart torn between tenderness and alarm. "I appreciate your concern," she whispered, "but I cannot let you dictate every interaction I have. I cannot move through this house afraid of displeasing you." The Duke's composure wavered, tension rippling across his features, as though her resistance struck a place inside him long guarded. "You think this is about displeasure?" he asked, stepping closer until the air between them grew taut. Celia, "Aye." But whatever confession he had been on the verge of making was swallowed by frustration, replaced instead by the cold, clipped tone she had heard only once before. "If you cannot trust my judgment," he said, "you jeopardize far more than your own welfare." The words pierced her, sharp and undeserved, awakening the old ache of every man who had once tried to shape her life to his will. She drew back, unable to mask the hurt trembling through her. For a heartbeat, something raw flickered in his gaze, regret perhaps, but he did not speak it, and as she stepped away from him, her voice quiet but steady, she said the truth neither wished to face. "I cannot trade one cage for another, Your Grace. Not even for you." Celia avoided the Duke for the remainder of the night, retreating to her chamber with a tightness in her chest that made each breath feel like an intrusion, yet sleep eluded her, as surely as peace. Long after the candles had burned low, echoes of their confrontation circled her mind, his rigid commands, his wounded gaze, her trembling refusal, and beneath it all a deeper ache whispered that she had hurt him, though she had spoken nothing but the truth of her own fragile boundaries. By morning, the storm clouds had thinned into a pale winter light, and she ventured into the conservatory seeking solace among the dew-brushed leaves. The familiar quiet steadied her for only a breath before she sensed a shift in the air behind her, the kind that made her blood warm and her spine straighten. Alistair stood in the doorway, not in his usual composed stillness, but with a hesitance she had never witnessed from him. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression shadowed, before stepping inside and closing the door with a gentleness that belied the turmoil etched across his features. "Celia," he said quietly, her name forming a tremor in the air, "I owe you an apology." She turned toward him slowly, unsure whether to brace herself or soften, but the sight of him, no armor, no cold command, only a man tangled in grief, unraveled her caution. He approached with careful steps, as though afraid to come too close, then rested his hand on the edge of the marble table beside them, gripping it as though anchoring himself. "I spoke to you last night as my father once spoke to me," he murmured, bitterness threading his tone, not out of wisdom but fear. The admission startled her, its vulnerability settling in her like a fragile weight. "Fear of what?" she whispered. He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of rare disarray. "Of losing someone again." Celia's breath caught, her pulse fluttering as he continued, voice low, almost reluctant. "My wife, she suffered more than society ever knew, not because of me, but because I did not protect her from the world's cruelty. I failed her. And when I see others turning their scrutiny toward you, I feel that failure return like a blade." His eyes met hers then, dark and unguarded. "I did not command you out of control, Celia. I did it because the thought of you suffering what she endured terrifies me." Her heart softened at the raw truth trembling in his voice, the pain that shaped every guarded edge of him. Slowly she stepped closer, her fingers brushing his sleeve, offering the quiet reassurance neither words nor propriety could provide. "You did not fail her," she whispered, though she knew he might never believe it. "And you do not need to protect me through restraint or fear. I only asked to walk beside you, not beneath your shadow." Something in his gaze shifted then, something soft, something hopeful, and as he bowed his head slightly, A breath of relief escaped him. In that fragile, firelit stillness of the conservatory, a new understanding formed between them, delicate yet unmistakably deeper than anything they had shared before. For a fleeting span of hours after their fragile reconciliation in the conservatory, Celia allowed herself to believe the worst of the tension between them had eased, that the wound her honesty had opened was beginning to knit itself closed by the quiet sincerity of the Duke's confession. Yet the unpredictability of Blackthorn Hall and the malice that seeped through its gilded corridors would not allow peace to settle so easily. By afternoon, Celia found herself summoned by a footman to the Duke's study, the gravity in his tone suggesting urgency rather than formality. She entered with her breath held tight in her chest, only to find Alistair standing rigid beside his desk, his expression carved from cold stone, a folded letter clenched in his hand. "Explain this," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened her more than any anger could. He extended the letter, and with trembling fingers she unfolded it, her eyes skimming words she had never written, phrases dripping with ambition, confessions of intent to leave Blackthorn Hall for a wealthier suitor, schemes she could never conceive. Her heart lurched, nausea rising as she stared at the forged signature at the bottom. "Your Grace," she whispered, voice breaking, "I did not write this." But his jaw tightened, a flicker of betrayal flashing through his eyes as though her denial struck a bruise he had tried desperately to protect. "This letter was delivered anonymously," he said, pacing a slow, deliberate circle around her. "It speaks of using my household for your advancement, of abandoning your family's debt the moment a better opportunity arises. Am I to believe you a victim of yet another conveniently timed deception?" Celia flinched, pain blooming in her chest as she struggled to breathe past the sting of his doubt. She wanted to shout the truth, to demand how he could question her after the honesty they had shared, but the words tangled with her desperation. "Someone is trying to harm us both," she said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Please, you must know my heart is not capable of such deceit." Her plea seemed to waver against the storm brewing behind his eyes. He stopped pacing, gripping the back of his chair with white, knuckled restraint. "I want to believe you," he said quietly, "but every time I draw closer, something arises to remind me of how easily trust can be misused." The ache in his voice should have comforted her, should have proven that doubt was born not of cruelty but fear, but it only deepened the wound slicing through her. Tears gathered despite her attempts to steady herself. "I would never harm you," she whispered, and though the truth rang clear, uncertainty lingered between them like a fog neither could pierce. Before she could speak again, a soft knock interrupted them, and a maid entered with a shaken curtsy, announcing that Lady Verena wished to apologize for a misunderstanding. The Duke's gaze darkened in dawning realization, but for Celia, the damage had already been done, and as she stepped back from him, heart hollowing with anguish, she knew their fragile bond had fractured once more under the weight of lies woven with cruel precision. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of shame and aching silence, for although the maid's trembling announcement had revealed Verena as the orchestrator of the forged letter, the realization came too late to spare Celia from the wound of the Duke's doubt. She withdrew to her chamber, her heart a hollow ache as she sat beside the frosted window, watching snowflakes drift like fragile promises she no longer dared believe in. She tried to compose herself, to make sense of the hurt that clung to her like a second skin, but each time she recalled the disbelief in Alistair's eyes, a fresh tremor shuddered through her. She did not know how long she remained there, minutes, hours, a lifetime of quiet unraveling, before the soft thud of approaching footsteps drew her from her stillness. The door opened with uncharacteristic hesitation, and the Duke stepped inside, his posture lacking its usual iron-bound certainty. He paused upon seeing her, his breath catching as though the sight of her sadness struck him with physical force. "Celia," he began, her name roughened by remorse, "I owe you an apology far greater than any I have ever given." She rose instinctively, though her hands trembled at her sides, unsure whether she could withstand the full weight of what he might say. He crossed the room slowly, as though afraid to startle her, and when he stopped before her, every shield he once held seemed to have fallen away. "Verena confessed," he said, voice low. "The letter was her doing, her envy, her malice, not your betrayal." Celia lowered her gaze, not because she doubted him, but because she feared the softness in his tone might unravel her completely. "You believed her lies," she whispered, unable to keep the hurt from seeping through. He flinched as though the words cut him. "I did," he admitted, "and in doing so I wronged you gravely." He drew a breath, hands curling at his sides. I reacted not with reason, but with fear. The fear that trust, something already fragile within me, had been misplaced again. She lifted her eyes then, meeting the raw vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "You speak of trust," she murmured, "yet you give it so sparingly." His throat worked as he searched for words. "Because I have so little left," he confessed. "But what I have, I would offer you, if you will accept it." Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of all that had been broken and all that might still be repaired. Celia's breath trembled as she stepped closer, heart aching with tenderness she no longer wished to deny. "I do not ask for perfection," she said softly. "Only honesty, only the chance to understand you, and be understood in return." His eyes closed briefly, a quiet exhale escaping him like a man receiving forgiveness he had not dared to hope for. When he opened them again, the shadows seemed lighter, the distance between them smaller. "Then allow me to begin again," he murmured. And in that fragile, hopeful moment, Celia felt something shift, trust, tentative yet real, taking root once more between their wounded hearts. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness so unexpected that Celia often found herself pausing mid-task, uncertain whether the quiet between her and the Duke was a fragile illusion or the beginning of something steadier, something earned rather than borrowed from longing. They moved through Blackthorn Hall with a new, tentative harmony, neither pretending the hurt had vanished, nor allowing it to loom over them like a shadow, waiting to reclaim its place. Alistair, though still reserved, no longer kept a rigid distance. Instead, he seemed to orbit closer, his presence a steady warmth instead of an intimidating force. When they discussed estate matters he had never before allowed another to witness, he listened to her suggestions with a surprising openness, his gaze softening whenever she offered insights he had not considered. Celia, in turn, found comfort in the quiet rhythm of their shared moments, walking through the gallery while he spoke of long, forgotten ancestors, reviewing correspondence by the fire, or lingering beside him during dusk as pale winter light spilled across the windows. These small pockets of companionship nurtured an unspoken truce, one that neither dared define but both leaned into instinctively. Yet beneath each exchange was an awareness, a muted but unyielding thread of emotion weaving them closer. He no longer watched her with suspicion but with thoughtfulness, as though memorizing the subtle shifts in her expressions, and she no longer tiptoed around him with the apprehension of before, but with a growing sense of safety she tried desperately not to misinterpret. Still, uncertainty lingered in the spaces between words. Celia often wondered whether the warmth she glimpsed in him was meant for her alone, or merely an echo of a man learning, after years of grief, to breathe again. And Alistair, for all his newfound gentleness, struggled visibly against the instinct to retreat whenever vulnerability surfaced too abruptly. One evening, as they walked the edge of the frozen gardens, he surprised her by asking about her childhood, not out of polite curiosity, but with a quiet sincerity that suggested he wished to know her beyond the assumptions the world had cast upon her. Celia spoke of small joys, of the loneliness she hid behind dutiful smiles, of dreams she dismissed because no one had ever asked to hear them. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable yet deeply attentive. When she finally faltered, uncertain whether she had revealed too much, he murmured, "You deserved more than what life gave you." The simplicity of the statement struck her harder than any grand confession could have. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw a man striving to bridge the distance between who he had been and who he wished to become. In that delicate moment she felt something shift, an understanding, a tether, a quiet beginning. And though neither reached for the other, their footsteps aligned as though guided by the same hesitant hope, binding them in a closeness that felt as natural as breath. The following afternoon, when the winter sky hung low and pale as brushed silver, Alistair surprised Celia by asking whether she would accompany him beyond the grounds, to a place he had not visited in years. His voice held none of the cold command she once feared. Instead, there was a quiet uncertainty beneath the request, as though her acceptance mattered more than he dared reveal. She agreed with a soft nod, and together they walked through the snow-dusted gardens until the manicured paths gave way to the untouched stillness of the surrounding woods. The air was crisp enough to sting her cheeks, yet the simple act of walking beside him warmed her in ways she could not admit aloud. For a time they said little, their steps synchronized in a rhythm that felt strangely intimate. Eventually the trees opened to reveal a small grove nestled in a hollow, where sunlight filtered through bare branches and scattered across the snow in shimmering fragments. Celia felt an immediate hush settle over her, sensing the space was somehow sacred. Alistair paused at the edge, his breath forming a thin cloud in the air as he stared at the grove with a gaze threaded in memory. "She loved this place," he said at last, his voice softened by a tenderness Celia had never heard from him. "My wife. On days when her mind was clear, she would walk here for hours." The confession was delivered without dramatics, without the tension of the past weighing every word. It was simply truth, aching and gentle. Celia's heart tightened as she stepped closer, not touching him but offering her presence like a quiet anchor. "It must have been very beautiful to her," she murmured. "As it is to me." He looked at her then, his expression shadowed yet open, as though revealing this part of his life had left him exposed, but strangely relieved. He spoke of the late Duchess with a mixture of sorrow and reverence, recounting moments of clarity she cherished and the despair that followed when illness clouded her mind. But there was no bitterness in his tone, only regret that he had not been able to shield her from the cruelty of others. Celia listened, not as a voyeur of grief, but as someone entrusted with a fragment of his truth, and the weight of that trust settled warmly in her chest. When silence finally returned to the grove, Alistair drew a slow breath, releasing something within himself as he did. "I have avoided this place for years," he admitted. "I thought coming here would deepen the ache. But now—" His gaze drifted toward her, softening with something fragile and earnest. "Now it feels different." Celia felt her pulse tremble, her breath catching with the unspoken meaning lingering between them. She wanted to reach for his hand, to ground him the way he had grounded her, but fear of overstepping stalled her. Still, the space between them felt irrevocably changed, gentler, warmer, shaped not by ghosts but by the quiet beginning of something startlingly alive. As they left the quiet sanctuary of the grove, the late afternoon light dimmed into a soft, wintry glow that shimmered across the snow, lending the world an otherworldly calm that felt almost suspended in time. Celia walked beside Alistair in silence, not out of discomfort but because the moment felt too delicate to disturb with clumsy words. The crisp air nipped at her cheeks, coloring them with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, and when a stray snowflake drifted down to settle on her lashes, she blinked it away with a small, unguarded smile. Alistair noticed. She saw it in the way his gaze softened, in the faint, nearly imperceptible pause of his breath. He slowed his stride until she matched him perfectly, and though he said nothing, she felt the weight of his attention like a gentle hand resting against her heart. Then it happened, so quietly and so naturally, that she wondered afterward whether fate itself had guided the moment. A snowflake landed on her cheek, delicate and crystalline, and before she could wipe it away, he reached out with a gloved hand, his fingers brushing her skin with a tenderness that startled them both. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, yet it felt as though the world narrowed to that single point of contact. Celia froze, breath suspended, her heart vaulting into her throat with a force that made her dizzy. She had felt his hands before, when he carried her, when he tended her wound, but never like this, never with a hesitation that trembled with unspoken longing. Alistair withdrew almost instantly, his hand dropping to his side as though the touch had burned him, yet he did not look away. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made the cold air between them pulse with warmth. "Forgive me," he murmured, though the apology rang hollow, as if he regretted not the act but the impulse it revealed. Celia swallowed hard, unable to summon words when her body felt weightless and unbearably aware of him. The wind stirred around them, sending a soft flurry across the path, but neither moved. It was he who finally broke the silence, his voice low and unsteady, stripped of the restraint he so carefully maintained. "You unsettle me," he said, "in ways I am not accustomed to." The confession slipped into the space between them like a breath of truth he could no longer hold back. Celia's pulse quickened, her hands trembling within her muff, yet the fear she might once have felt did not return. Instead, a warmth spread through her, a fragile, consuming hope. "I do not wish to unsettle you," she whispered, "but I cannot pretend I feel unaffected either." Something shifted in his gaze then, a softening, a quiet breaking open. And though neither stepped closer, the space between them felt irrevocably smaller, as though one more heartbeat might bring them together completely. The following morning dawned cold and pale, the kind of winter light that seemed to drain color from the world, yet Celia felt an unspoken brightness lingering beneath her ribs, a fragile warmth born from the memory of the Duke's gloved hand brushing her cheek. She carried that quiet, trembling hope with her as she descended the staircase, unaware that the day would soon shatter the delicate calm she had only just begun to trust. The first sign of trouble came in the echo of carriage wheels crunching over frozen gravel, a sound too unannounced, too heavy with purpose to belong to an ordinary guest. A footman hurried past her toward the entryway while Celia slowed her steps, an inexplicable dread unfurling inside her. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw him, Lord Hawthorne, standing in the grand foyer with the polished ease of a man who believed charm could disguise cruelty. He greeted the Duke with a smile too sharp to be sincere, his eyes flicking toward Celia with a recognition that made her blood run cold. In an instant, memories she had fought to bury clawed their way back. Memories of his false courtship, his calculated humiliation, his laughter echoing as though her heartbreak were nothing more than an amusing anecdote. She stiffened, instinct urging her to retreat, but before she could move, Hawthorne stepped forward. "Lady Celia," he drawled, bowing with exaggerated politeness. "How fortunate to find you here. I had heard you were settling in." The insinuation in his tone tightened her throat, yet before she could summon a response, Alistair positioned himself between them with a swiftness that startled even Hawthorne. The Duke's expression had transformed into something cold and immovable, the kind of stillness that warned of storms yet to break. "You will address her with respect," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. Hawthorne's smile thinned. "My apologies, Your Grace. I merely wished to greet an old acquaintance." Celia's pulse hammered, her hands trembling at her sides, but she found herself moving closer to the Duke, drawn by the strength in his stance, by the silent assurance radiating from him. Hawthorne's gaze flicked between them, amusement mingling with something darker, calculation, perhaps, or jealousy. "It appears much has changed since last we spoke," he murmured. Alistair's jaw tightened. "Indeed, and I suggest you remember it." The words vibrated with a possession he did not name, yet Hawthorne heard it all the same, his eyes gleaming with unspoken challenge. Celia felt the room constrict around her, yet she also felt the Duke's presence, solid, unwavering, shielding her from the familiar cruelty she once feared would define her future. In that moment she understood something with stunning clarity. The past she had spent years trying to escape had now collided with the life she was beginning to build, and the man who stood before her with fierce protectiveness was not merely defending her honor, he was defending the fragile, emerging bond between them. The tension lingering in the foyer did not dissolve once Hawthorne moved deeper into the manor. Instead, it slithered through the corridors like smoke seeking new places to stain, and Celia felt its presence long after the Duke escorted her away from the confrontation. She attempted to steady herself with quiet breaths, reminding her trembling heart that she was no longer the naive girl Hawthorne once belittled, yet the memory of his smirk clung to her like frost. She found a moment of solitude in the music room, settling near the pianoforte not to play but to gather her thoughts, when the faint sound of approaching footsteps made her stiffen. Hawthorne entered the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed doors opened merely because he wished them to. Celia rose at once, intending to leave, but he stepped into her path, his smile too polished to disguise the cruelty beneath. "Running away?" he asked mildly, fingertips brushing the keys as though idly testing the instrument. How familiar. She forced herself to hold his gaze, drawing strength from the memory of the Duke's steady presence. "I have no desire to speak with you," she said, surprised at the steadiness of her voice. Hawthorne's expression sharpened, amusement flickering into something colder. "Then allow me to speak, for it seems you've grown bold enough to require a warning." He leaned closer, not touching her, yet invading her space with a deliberate, suffocating intent. "The Duke of Ravencourt is not a man whose past should be admired. His late wife did not simply fall ill, she was broken. And if society knew the truth, his reputation would crumble faster than the ice outside these walls." Celia felt her breath stutter, but she refused to step back. "You lie," she whispered, though doubt flickered painfully through her chest. Hawthorne laughed softly. "Do I? Or do I merely know the things he keeps hidden? Secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when a man like him forms an attachment he should avoid." She understood the insinuation immediately. The threat was not aimed at Alistair alone, but at her, meant to fracture whatever fragile trust had begun to form. "You wish to harm him," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You wish to harm us both." His smile widened, sharp as glass. "I only wish to see justice, or entertainment, whichever arrives first." With that, he stepped aside, granting her passage not out of courtesy, but because he believed he had already unsettled her enough to achieve his purpose. Celia left the room with her heart pounding, every step heavy with fear and determination. She knew she could not keep this from the Duke, even if the truth wounded him more deeply than any rumor ever could. And as she made her way toward his study, she understood one thing with stark clarity. The threat Hawthorne carried was not one she could ignore, for it had the power to destroy not only the man she had come to trust, but the fragile hope she had only just begun to feel. Celia had scarcely reached the threshold of the Duke's study when she found him already striding toward her, tension coiled through every line of his body, as though he sensed the upheaval before she spoke a single word. His gaze swept over her face, reading the distress she tried, unsuccessfully, to suppress, and he ushered her inside with a quiet urgency that made her heart tremble. She told him everything. Her voice shook, but she forced each detail into the air: Hawthorne's insinuations about the late Duchess, the veiled threat cloaked beneath his polished cruelty, the way he seemed to relish the idea of tearing apart whatever fragile bond had begun to form between them. With every sentence, Alistair's expression darkened, his composure fracturing like glass beneath a tightening fist. By the time she finished, he stood rigid beside the fireplace, his breath deep and ragged, his hands clenched so tightly Celia feared he might draw blood. "He dares speak of her," he murmured, the words low and trembling with a fury so controlled it frightened her more than any outburst could. "He dares drag her memory into his games." Before she could reach for him, Hawthorne himself entered the study without knocking, a smirk already poised on his lips as though he had orchestrated their turmoil for his amusement. Alistair turned toward him with a stillness that vibrated with contained violence, his voice a quiet death knell. "Leave, now." Hawthorne stepped closer instead, his tone dripping mock sympathy. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Your Grace. Perhaps Lady Celia should know what became of your wife, or perhaps she should know what the world whispered, that grief was not the only reason you retreated from society." The last thread of restraint snapped. Alistair lunged, grabbing Hawthorne by the front of his coat and slamming him against the wall with such force the portraits rattled. Hawthorne choked out a laugh, even as panic flickered in his eyes. "There it is, the temper they warned us about." Celia's breath seized, terror and helplessness surging through her as she rushed forward, placing a trembling hand against Alistair's arm. "Stop, please," she whispered, her voice unsteady yet urgent. "Do not let him make you into what he claims." Her touch was the single thing capable of reaching him. Alistair froze, breath shuddering, his muscles taut beneath her palm as though he were battling a storm inside himself. Slowly, painfully slowly, he released Hawthorne, stepping back with the haunted look of a man who had nearly betrayed everything he fought to control. Hawthorne straightened, eyes gleaming with malicious triumph, but he said nothing further. The Duke's voice, when it finally surfaced, was low and raw. "Get out," he said. And this time, Hawthorne obeyed. When the door shut behind them, Alistair sagged against the edge of the desk, his chest rising and falling with broken breaths, and Celia realized with a piercing clarity that the man before her was not frightening, only deeply, unbearably afraid of losing the last pieces of himself he had fought to preserve. Celia remained by the Duke's side long after Hawthorne fled the study, watching the tremor in his breath gradually settle into something steadier, though the raw edges of fury and shame still clung to him like shadows refusing to lift. She longed to offer comfort, to reach for him with a certainty she did not yet possess, but before she could speak he straightened abruptly and murmured that he needed a moment alone. Reluctantly she obeyed, retreating into the quiet halls where her thoughts churned with worry, fear, and a burgeoning determination she could not ignore. It was this restless need to understand, to shield him as he had shielded her, that guided her steps toward the portrait gallery, an instinct rather than a choice. She entered the long, vaulted room with a shiver, for though she had walked these halls before, she now saw them through the lens of Hawthorne's threat, searching for whatever secret he had intended to weaponize. Her gaze drifted to the veiled portrait at the far end, the one Alistair had reacted to with such unmistakable pain. Compelled by something deeper than curiosity, Celia approached it slowly, fingers trembling as she lifted the heavy velvet drape. Beneath it lay not the cruel face society imagined, nor the evidence of a sinister past, but the portrait of a woman with soft eyes and a serene, fragile smile, a woman whose beauty carried a melancholy that pierced Celia's heart. The Duchess. Celia stepped back, startled by the tenderness the artist had captured. If this was the face Hawthorne sought to twist into scandal, then Celia could not yet fathom how. A rustle behind the frame drew her attention, and she discovered a leather-bound journal tucked discreetly into a recess in the wall. Her breath caught as she opened it, The pages filled with the delicate handwriting of the Duchess herself. She skimmed the entries, fragments of joy, moments of clarity, but also lines trembling with confusion, sorrow, and fear born not of cruelty, but of an illness that stole her sense of self-peace by fragile peace. The truth unfurled with devastating clarity. The Duke had not been a tormentor, but a man desperately trying to protect his wife's dignity as her mind unraveled under a condition neither medicine nor society could understand. He had withdrawn from the world to shield her from its cruelty, bearing the weight of its twisted rumors so she would not have to. Celia felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with grief not for herself but for the man who carried this unjust burden alone. She closed the journal gently, understanding now why Hawthorne's insinuations struck so deeply, because they threatened not only the Duke's character, but the sanctuary of a memory he had spent years trying to preserve. As she lowered the velvet cloth back over the portrait, she knew with painful certainty that this truth could destroy him if wielded by the wrong hands, and she also knew that she would not, could not, allow that to happen. Celia remained in the gallery only long enough to steady her trembling breath, her fingers brushing the velvet drape one final time as resolve ignited in her chest, a fierce, unwavering resolve she had never known she possessed. Hawthorne's cruelty could no longer be met with quiet endurance. His lies had twisted too close to the heart of a man who had suffered more than society could ever comprehend. And so, when she stepped back into the corridor and saw him lingering near the staircase with that smug tilt to his lips, something inside her stilled into a calm born not of fear, but of purpose. She approached him with deliberate steps, each one soft yet unyielding until she stood directly before him. "Lord Hawthorne," she said, her voice carrying a clarity that startled even herself, "we must speak." He raised a brow, amused, as though her challenge were nothing more than an afternoon diversion. "Must we? I assumed you would be too shaken to seek me out." Celia met his gaze steadily. "You have wounded a good man with your lies, and you intend to wound him further." His smile sharpened. "Truth is merely a matter of who speaks it first." Her breath caught, but she did not falter. "Then allow me to speak mine." She reached into her cloak and drew out the Duchess's journal, not opening it but holding it firmly, letting him see that she understood far more than he anticipated. "You know nothing of her suffering," she said, her tone firm. "Nothing of the illness that stole her from herself. Nothing of the care the Duke provided in silence because the world would not have shown her mercy." Hawthorne's eyes flickered, a brief crack in his mask of confidence. "You have no idea what you are meddling in," he hissed, forced calm slipping away. "On the contrary," Celia replied, stepping closer, "I know exactly what I am protecting." His jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring in frustration. "Sentiment will not save you," he sneered. "Nor him." Celia's voice lowered, steady as a blade. "But truth will destroy you." She did not shout, did not tremble. She simply let the weight of the words sink into the air between them. Hawthorne's expression twisted, but before he could retaliate, footsteps echoed through the gallery entrance. Alistair appeared, halting mid-step as he took in the scene. Celia standing tall, Hawthorne recoiling, the journal in her hand like a shield forged from the past itself. For a heartbeat, silence surged, taut and electric. Then Hawthorne spoke with forced nonchalance. "I see you've found a loyal defender, Your Grace." Alistair's gaze shifted from him to Celia, and something in his expression, pride, awe, dawning affection, softened the stern lines of his face. "Indeed," he murmured, his voice low but resonant, "and one far braver than you will ever be." Hawthorne stiffened, fury twisting his features, but Alistair stepped forward, his presence a wall of unyielding authority. "Leave Blackthorn Hall," he said quietly, "before whatever dignity you pretend to possess abandons you entirely." And this time, the threat in his voice left no room for argument. The moment Hawthorne vanished from the gallery, his footsteps echoing in clipped, furious strides, Celia felt the tension slowly drain from her limbs, leaving behind a trembling mixture of relief and the startling awareness that she had just stepped into a battle far larger than herself. Yet before she could gather her scattered breath, Alistair turned toward her with an expression she had never seen, a raw blend of astonishment and something softer, something perilously close to reverence. He approached her slowly, as though fearing one wrong movement might shatter the fragile courage she had shown. "Celia," he said quietly, her name unfurling from his lips like a confession. "What you did, I have no words for it." She lowered her gaze, heat rising to her cheeks, the Duchess's journal still clutched in her hand. "I only wished to protect what mattered," she whispered. Alistair halted before her, his breath unsteady, his composure frayed at the edges. You confronted him, alone. You faced a man who delights in cruelty, and you did so without hesitation. His voice thickened, the weight of his emotions slipping into every syllable. No one has ever done such a thing for me. She dared to meet his eyes then, and the vulnerability she found there struck her with breathtaking force. Gone was the distant, inscrutable Duke the world feared. In his place stood a man stripped bare of his defenses, a man who seemed for the first time to let her see the full depth of his loneliness. He sought to harm you, Celia said gently. I could not allow that. Silence settled between them, warm and aching, until Alistair's gaze shifted to the journal she held. You saw it, he murmured, pain flickering through his eyes. You saw her truth. Celia nodded slowly. I saw her suffering, and your devotion. His jaw tightened, his breath catching as though he had been struck. For years I have carried the burden of society's whispers, he said. I let them believe I was cold, unfeeling, even cruel. It was easier than exposing her to their scorn. Celia stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. You were protecting her, and yourself. His eyes closed, the weight of her understanding sinking into him like warmth into winter, thinned skin. When he looked at her again, something had shifted, something fragile and unguarded. You see me, he said softly, more clearly than anyone has in a very long time. The confession trembled in the air between them, delicate as frost yet carrying the promise of thaw. Celia felt her pulse quicken, her heart aching with a tenderness she could no longer deny. And you, she whispered, see me as no one ever has. For a suspended moment they stood in the quiet heart of the gallery, framed by portraits of past lives. Two souls who had spent years expecting nothing finding, at last, the beginning of something extraordinary. For the briefest stretch of hours after Hawthorne's departure, Blackthorn Hall felt almost peaceful, as though the very walls exhaled in relief. But Celia sensed, deep in the fragile steadiness of her chest, that such calm could not last. The morning after her confrontation in the gallery, she descended to the breakfast room to find the Duke absent and the atmosphere tinged with an uneasiness she could not place. Servants exchanged glances, guests spoke in lowered voices, and a tension, faint but unmistakable, settled like frost along the edges of her awareness. She attempted to push the feeling aside, yet when a footman hurried toward her with a sealed letter addressed to her father, her pulse faltered. The crest pressed into the wax belonged not to Alistair nor any familiar acquaintance. It bore Hawthorne's sigil. Fear curled cold and sharp in her stomach as she broke the seal, scanning the contents with widening eyes. The letter claimed that her father had incurred a substantial debt during a failed investment, one tied, conveniently and suspiciously, to Hawthorne's enterprises. Unless the sum was repaid in full, it stated, legal action would be taken that could result in the forfeiture of their home and even imprisonment. Celia's fingers trembled as she clutched the paper, her breath quickening as dread flooded her veins. Her father had made mistakes. Yes, poor decisions born of desperation, but this debt was not one of them. Hawthorne had fabricated it, constructed a trap not only to ruin her family but to force her away from the Duke, severing their fragile, growing bond before it had a chance to root. She knew immediately she could not tell Alistair. He would fight for her, challenge Hawthorne openly, and Hawthorne would twist that into further scandal, accusing Alistair of impropriety, manipulation, even coercion. The Duke's reputation, already a delicate construct burdened by years of unjust rumor, could not withstand such a direct assault. And so Celia folded the letter with slow, steady breaths, hiding it within the folds of her gown as she retreated from the room. Each step felt heavier, her thoughts tangled with fear and guilt. Hawthorne's threat had not been idle. He intended to destroy them both, and the burden of protecting Alistair now pressed against her ribs with suffocating weight. She wandered the silent corridor outside the study, unable to shake the image of the Duke, vulnerable, unguarded, trusting her in ways that left her breathless, and her heart ached with a yearning she had never allowed herself to feel so deeply. She could not be the reason he fell again. She could not be the storm that tore apart a man still learning to breathe beyond grief. As she stood in the dim light filtering through the tall windows, the decision settled upon her with terrible clarity. If leaving Blackthorn Hall was the price of safeguarding him, then she would pay it, even if it shattered her, even if it meant losing the one person who had ever truly seen her. And so, with trembling hands and a heart already fracturing, Celia began to plan her quiet disappearance at dawn. Celia slipped away before the first blush of dawn touched the frost-laced windows, her cloak drawn tight around her trembling form as she moved silently through Blackthorn Hall, each step echoing with the weight of a choice she wished she had never been forced to make. She left no trace save for a folded note on her writing desk, half apology, half plea, begging Alistair not to search for her, insisting that distance was the only protection she could offer him. Her breath shuddered as she crossed the threshold of the manor into the winter, dark morning, the cold biting through her resolve as she limped toward the narrow path that led toward the old chapel where she had once found solace as a child. Snow fell in muted whispers, softening the world around her, yet each flake seemed to burrow into her skin with the reminder of all she was leaving behind. The Duke's steady gaze, his rare, fragile smiles, the unspoken connection that had begun to form like a fragile bloom in the heart of winter. But she did not waver. To stay would be to invite Hawthorne's next blow, one aimed not at her but at the man she had come to cherish beyond fear. As she disappeared into the trees, the note she left behind sat in the quiet of her chamber, waiting like a silent wound for the man who would soon find it. When Alistair awoke to the news of her absence, something in him broke with a force he had not felt since the day he lost his wife. Her empty room, her discarded slippers, her missing cloak, each detail struck him with mounting terror until he found the folded note. His hands shook as he read her trembling handwriting, the words blurring as a storm gathered not outside but within him. "Do not follow me." The plea did nothing but ignite his determination. Within minutes he had thrown on his coat and ordered his horse readied despite the storm brewing across the moorlands. Servants tried to dissuade him, but the fear in his eyes was not something that could be reasoned with. It was raw, primal, the fear of losing not a companion nor a guest, but the one person who had cracked open the walls he had spent years fortifying. He rode into the storm with reckless urgency, snow slicing across his vision, wind howling like a beast around him. He called her name into the biting cold, straining to hear even the faintest reply, but the world answered only with silence. Hours passed, each one deepening his dread as he searched roads, frozen ponds, forest edges, anywhere she might have wandered. His breath grew ragged, his hands numb, yet he pressed on with a desperation that bordered on agony. For every image that flashed through his mind, Celia alone, Celia in danger, Celia believing she was unworthy of his protection, his heart twisted tighter. He could not lose her. Not now, not when he had only just begun to imagine a life no longer defined by loss. And so he continued, his horse laboring beneath him, until at last he spotted a set of faint, uneven footprints, disappearing into the woods, the fragile trail of the woman he would not, could not, abandon. The footprints staggered through the snow like a fragile lifeline, weaving between the skeletal branches of the winter wood, and Alistair followed them with a desperation that hollowed out his breath and sharpened every beat of his heart. The deeper he went, the harsher the storm became, wind lashing against him as though determined to force him back, but he pressed forward with a resolve that felt carved from the very bone of him. When the faint outline of the abandoned chapel finally emerged through the swirling white, a dark, crumbling silhouette against the storm, he felt fear coil around his ribs with a vicious grip. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, stumbling through the drifts toward the warped wooden door, praying he was not too late. Inside, the air was frigid, the silence suffocating, and for a moment he saw nothing but shadows. Then his gaze fell upon a pale figure collapsed near the altar, her cloak dusted in snow, her body curled as though trying to hold itself together. Celia. Her name tore from him in a voice raw with terror, and he dropped to his knees beside her, gathering her into his arms with a gentleness born from panic. Her skin was ice against his palms, her breath shallow, her lips tinged dangerously blue. She stirred faintly at the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttering open with agonizing slowness. "You should not have come," she whispered, the words barely a breath, yet they cut him deeper than any blade. "You asked me not to," he answered, his voice breaking as he pressed her closer to his chest, trying to share his warmth. "And you knew I would ignore it." A fractured smile trembled at the corners of her mouth, but sorrow clouded her eyes. "I only wanted to protect you. Hawthorne will not stop. He means to ruin you." Alistair shook his head fiercely, brushing snow from her hair with trembling fingers. "I do not care what he intends. I care about you." His voice dropped, rough and earnest. "Celia, losing you would ruin me far more deeply than anything Hawthorne could contrive." Tears gathered behind her lashes, melting into the frost on her cheeks. "I feared I would only bring you pain." "You bring me back to life," he whispered, the confession slipping free as though torn from the deepest part of him. Emotions surged between them, tender and fierce, filling the cold chapel with a warmth no flame could replicate. He wrapped her securely in his cloak, lifting her with a strength born of sheer determination. "I am taking you home," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture both desperate and reverent. Celia leaned into him, her fingers clutching weakly at his coat as though anchoring herself to the world through him alone. As he carried her toward the door, the storm raged outside. But for the first time since he had ridden into its heart, Alistair felt something stronger than fear guiding him, something unbreakable, for he knew, as surely as breath, that he would never let her face another winter alone. The journey back to Blackthorn Hall unfolded in a blur of bitter wind and frantic resolve as Alistair carried Celia through the storm, her fragile weight pressed against his chest, while every harsh gust seemed determined to tear her from him. He refused to relinquish her even for a moment, shielding her from the icy air with his body as he mounted his exhausted horse and held her securely against him, whispering reassurances. She drifted in and out of hearing. Snow clung to their cloaks, their hair, their lashes, blurring the world into a muted haze through which only the sound of the Duke's pounding heartbeat seemed real. Celia stirred weakly as they crossed the final stretch toward the manor, her fingers curling faintly into the fabric of his coat as though reaching for something beyond mere warmth. "Alistair," she breathed, so softly he might have imagined it had her breath not trembled against his throat. He bent his head, his voice strained with fear he could no longer hide. "I am here. I will not let you go." She tried to speak again, to explain, to apologize, but her strength faltered, and she fell silent as he urged the horse onward. By the time they reached the entrance of Blackthorn Hall, servants were already rushing forward, gasping at the sight of the half-frozen woman in their duke's arms. He barked orders with a sharpness born not of anger but terror, commanding hot water, blankets, and the physician at once. Yet even as he relinquished Celia to their care, his hand lingered against her cheek, unwilling to break contact until necessity forced him. Hours passed in a suffocating fog of waiting, while the physician worked to warm her, restore her strength, and calm the violent shivering that racked her body. Alistair paced the length of the small sitting room outside her chamber, every footstep a quiet, desperate prayer. His composure, so prized, so practiced, cracked under the weight of his guilt. He should have protected her from Hawthorne, from fear, from believing she must bear the world's cruelty alone. When the physician finally emerged with a grave but hopeful nod, the Duke wasted no time entering the chamber where Celia now lay wrapped in blankets, her cheeks flushed faintly with returning warmth. She looked impossibly fragile, yet unmistakably alive, and the sight drove him to his knees beside her bed. Her eyes opened slowly, hazy with exhaustion, but when they met his, a soft light flickered within them, as though her spirit recognized him before her mind fully stirred. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you come for me?" Alistair took her hand gently, his thumb brushing the back of it with reverence. "Because you asked me not to," he answered softly, a tremor of unspoken emotion threading through his words. "And because losing you would have destroyed me." Tears gathered in Celia's eyes, spilling down her temples in silent, trembling drops. "I only wanted to protect you." "You do," he murmured, cupping her cheek with a tenderness so raw it felt like confession. "More than you know." Their gazes locked, the distance between them dissolving into something fragile and profound. In the hush of the snow-laden night, with only the soft crackle of the hearth bearing witness, Celia drew a shaky breath, summoning a courage born of love rather than fear. "Then stay," she whispered. "Just stay with me." And Alistair, who had spent years fearing the weight of his own heart, leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against hers, answering in a voice barely above a breath, "There is nowhere else I would ever choose to be." Isnaid. The following morning broke softly over Blackthorn Hall, pale winter sunlight filtering through the frost, touched windows of Celia's chamber and casting a muted glow across the room where she slept, her breath steady, her color restored just enough to ease the Duke's relentless worry. Alistair had not left her side through the night. He sat slumped in the chair beside her bed, his posture rigid with exhaustion, though his gaze never strayed far from her face. Each rise and fall of her chest felt like a fragile miracle, grounding him in a reality he had feared would slip away. When Celia finally stirred, her eyelashes fluttering like the first touch of warmth after a long frost, he straightened instantly, leaning closer with a gentleness so instinctive it startled even him. She blinked at him, confusion softening into relief as recognition settled in her eyes. "You stayed," she murmured, her voice still threadbare with fatigue. "Of course," he replied, though the word came too quickly, too roughly, betraying how deeply the truth sat within him. Celia attempted to sit up, and Alistair immediately supported her shoulders, adjusting the pillows behind her with careful hands. The closeness stirred something inside him, an ache, a longing, but he forced himself to move slowly, respectfully, as though any sudden motion might frighten her away. Once she was settled, she studied him with a quiet intensity that made the room feel painfully small. "You should have slept," she whispered. He shook his head. "I could not." The simplicity of the statement deepened the flush on her cheeks, but before she could respond, his expression shifted, the weight of unspoken fears gathering behind his eyes. "Celia," he began, his voice low and strained, "do you understand what your leaving did to me?" She lowered her gaze, guilt rippling through her features. "I only meant to protect you, from Hawthorne's threats, from the scandal he wished to create. I feared that staying would cost you everything." He exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in pain. "And losing you would cost me more." Her breath caught, and the silence that followed pressed gently against them, laden with emotion neither had dared speak aloud. At last he continued, his tone trembling despite his effort to remain composed. "I have spent years believing that attachment was a danger, that allowing someone close would only bring sorrow. But when I found you in that chapel, when I believed for even a moment that I might lose you, every one of those beliefs shattered." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture uncharacteristically unguarded. "You have become more to me than I know how to articulate." Celia lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed emotion. "And you," she whispered, "are more to me than fear ever allowed me to admit." The confession settled between them like a fragile, luminous thread, binding their hearts with an honesty neither could retreat from. Alistair reached for her hand, hesitantly, reverently, and when she intertwined her fingers with his, something inside him broke open in a way that felt like the beginning of healing rather than hurt. For a long moment they sat in quiet communion, two souls who had carried their loneliness like armor, now daring at last to lower it. Outside, snow began to fall again in soft, drifting spirals, but within that sunlit room, warmth grew, slowly, quietly, undeniably, marking the first true dawn of a devotion he could no longer hide. Celia's strength returned slowly over the next 2 days, yet her chamber remained a sanctuary neither she nor Alistair seemed willing to abandon, as though the walls themselves held the fragile beginnings of something too precious to expose to the scrutiny of the world beyond. Whenever she tried to rise, he would appear beside her with a steadiness that softened into worry the moment she winced. Whenever he attempted to leave, her gaze would follow him with such quiet longing that he found himself lingering in the doorway, unable to sever even a moment of connection between them. On the third morning, with sunlight spilling across her blankets like a promise, she insisted on sitting by the window, her legs still weak but her spirit warmer than it had been in days. Alistair guided her with painstaking gentleness, his hand steady at her elbow, and when she finally settled into the cushioned chair overlooking the snow-draped grounds, she smiled, a true, soft smile that seemed to dissolve the last lingering shadows of fear within him. "It is beautiful," she murmured, watching flakes drift lazily across the frozen fields. "I never realized winter could feel." She paused, searching for the right word. "Kind." Alistair's chest tightened with something perilously close to wonder. "Winter has always held its own quiet beauty," he replied. "One sees it only when no longer bracing for the cold." She looked up at him then, and the meaning behind her gaze, tender, grateful, full of unspoken understanding, nearly unmade him. He moved to stand beside her, his fingers brushing the back of her hand in a gesture so natural it felt as though he had been waiting years to make it. "Celia," he began, the soft gravity of her name grounding him. "I have been thinking of what may come after this." Her breath stilled, though her heartbeat fluttered like a startled bird. "After?" He nodded slowly. "When you are well, when this storm, Hawthorne, the rumors, the shadows of the past, has passed." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I find myself wondering whether you would wish to remain at Blackthorn Hall, not as a guest, not as a duty, but because you would choose it." Celia's hand trembled beneath his, not with fear, but with an emotion so profound it left her breathless. "Alistair," she whispered, "you know what the world would say if I stayed." His jaw tightened, though not in anger, rather in quiet defiance. "Let them speak," he murmured. "I have lived half a lifetime bending beneath the judgment of others. I will not sacrifice happiness to their opinions." The word happiness struck her like a warm wind in the midst of frost. "And would you?" she faltered, the vulnerability in her voice raw. "Would you find such happiness with me?" He exhaled softly, as though releasing a truth he had held locked within his ribcage for far too long. "I already do." Her lips parted, breath trembling as her fingers curled into his. The room felt impossibly still, as though time itself recognized the gravity of the moment. But before either dared speak the words rising between them, a sudden knock at the chamber door shattered the fragile stillness. A footman stepped inside, bowing nervously. "Your Grace, there is news you must hear. It concerns Lord Hawthorne." Alistair's expression darkened, and Celia felt her pulse quicken with dread, the tender quiet they had woven now trembling beneath the weight of a new threat waiting to unfold. The footman's trembling announcement lingered in the air like a draught of cold air, slicing through the fragile intimacy that had been building between Celia and Alistair. The Duke straightened, every trace of softness vanishing beneath the quiet steel of a man preparing for battle, and for a moment Celia feared he might shut her out entirely, reverting to the rigid solitude he had once worn like armor. But when his gaze shifted to her, steady, searching, she saw not retreat, but a silent vow that whatever was coming, he would not face it alone. "Tell me," he ordered calmly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. The footman swallowed. "Your Grace, Lord Hawthorne has summoned a magistrate. He claims Lady Celia fled your estate to escape coercion. He intends to bring charges." Celia felt the blood drain from her face, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair as though the world had tilted beneath her feet. Alistair's expression hardened into something dangerously still, his eyes darkening as though a shadow had passed through them. "Coercion," he repeated, voice low, almost disbelieving. The footman nodded shakily. "He insists she was detained here against her will, and that her attempted departure in the snow was proof of mistreatment." Celia inhaled sharply, guilt and fear twisting inside her with vicious intensity. Her leaving, her foolish attempt to protect Alistair, was now being wielded as a weapon against him. "No," she whispered, rising too quickly and gripping the bedpost for balance. "This is my doing. If I had not left, if I had not—" Alistair cut her off gently but firmly, his hand finding hers with a certainty that steadied her trembling heart. "You left because he manipulated you," he said. "Because he preyed on your fear. This is not your fault." But despite his assurance, she saw the weight pressing on him, the old wound of being misjudged, his honor questioned, his intentions twisted into something monstrous. It was a wound Hawthorne now sought to reopen with ruthless precision. Celia drew a shaky breath. What will happen? He turned toward the window where snow still drifted in soft, deceptive innocence. "If Hawthorne persuades the magistrate, formal inquiry will follow. He hopes to tarnish my name beyond repair, and ruin you, by implication." His hand tightened around hers. "He wants to make us both prisoners of his lies." A long silence fell, broken only by the soft crackle of the hearth. Then, slowly, Alistair knelt before her, not in supplication, but in solemn communion, his hands resting gently atop hers. "Celia," he murmured, "I have spent years fearing the world's judgment, but I will not stand by while he uses you to destroy what fragile peace I have found. I will face him, and I will not allow you to be used as a shield or weapon in his schemes." Her breath trembled. "But what if he twists everything? What if the magistrate believes him? What if your reputation—" "My reputation," he interrupted softly, "is far less important than your safety, your name, your future." His gaze held hers with devastating tenderness. "If the world must know the truth to protect you, then it will." Celia shook her head, tears gathering despite her will. "You would risk everything?" He lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a reverent kiss against her knuckles, the gentlest affirmation she had ever known. "For you," he whispered, "I would risk far more." And though fear still clung to them like the remnants of winter, Celia felt something shift, something fierce and bright. The certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as frightened strangers bound by circumstance, but as two hearts choosing, finally, to stand unafraid. The magistrate's arrival at Blackthorn Hall the next morning cast a pall over the estate, as though the very air thickened beneath the weight of accusation and the threat of scandal. Guests whispered behind gloved hands, servants moved with nervous haste, and the great halls that once felt vast and timeless seemed suddenly too small to contain the tension brewing inside them. Celia had barely slept. She sat near the hearth in her chamber, hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady the dread trembling through her every breath. Though Alistair had assured her repeatedly that she bore no blame and would not face Hawthorne alone, fear gnawed at her, fear not of punishment, but of watching the man she had grown to love stand trial for crimes born of lies and malice. When the summons finally came, she walked beside Alistair with careful steps, his presence a steady anchor at her side. They entered the drawing room where the magistrate awaited, a stern, faced man with sharp spectacles and an expression that suggested little tolerance for deceit. Hawthorne stood near the windows, his posture relaxed, a picture of false civility that made Celia's stomach twist. "Your Grace," the magistrate began, adjusting his spectacles, "Lord Hawthorne has brought forth serious concerns regarding the treatment of Lady Celia during her stay." Alistair inclined his head, calm but cold. "Concerns which I trust will dissolve once the lady herself is heard." Hawthorne smiled thinly. "And what she feels compelled to say in the Duke's presence may differ greatly from the truth." Celia froze, fury rising within her as Hawthorne continued. "She attempted to flee the estate in the dead of night. That alone indicates duress. Perhaps fear." "Fear," Alistair said sharply, "that you yourself cultivated." The magistrate raised a hand, urging civility, though his eyes flicked between them with growing curiosity. "Lady Celia," he said, turning to her, "does the letter you left not suggest coercion, isolation, fear for your own well-being?" Her heart pounded, but she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I wrote those words because I believed Lord Hawthorne would use my presence here to harm his grace. I fled only to shield him from the lies Lord Hawthorne has woven." Hawthorne scoffed. "And what lies have I supposedly crafted?" Celia met his gaze, with a courage she did not know she possessed. "The false debt you claimed my father owed, the forged confession you tried to place in my name, and now this fabrication of coercion." Murmurs rippled through the room. The magistrate's brows lifted. "Serious accusations, my lady. Have you evidence?" Celia nodded, producing the Duchess's journal, not as accusation, but as truth. "Lord Hawthorne threatened to expose intimate details of the Duke's late wife to destroy him. He preys on vulnerability, not justice." The magistrate accepted the journal, flipping through the delicate pages. His expression softened with understanding as he read the entries: gentle thoughts, fading clarity, pleas for dignity. When he closed the book, his gaze rested firmly on Hawthorne. "This is not the writing of a woman oppressed, nor does it support the claims you attempt to leverage." Hawthorne's composure faltered, anger flashing cold and sharp, but the magistrate continued, "Your allegations appear to lack foundation, and given Lady Celia's testimony, it is you, Lord Hawthorne, whose intentions warrant further inquiry." For the first time, Hawthorne seemed at a loss for words. Alistair stepped forward, voice low, resonant. "You sought to ruin her, and me. You will not succeed." The magistrate nodded. "I see no evidence of coercion here, only malice." Relief washed over Celia so swiftly her knees trembled, and Alistair's hand found her back, steadying her with a gentleness that eased the last remnants of fear from her heart. The truth, finally, irrevocably, stood in the light. The drawing room slowly emptied after the magistrate's judgment, but Celia remained rooted beside the hearth, her breath coming in uneven waves as the enormity of what had just unfolded settled over her like the final hush after a storm. Hawthorne's sharp steps echoed down the corridor, fading into nothing as he was escorted away to await formal inquiry. Yet the shadows he had cast over their lives lingered, clinging to the corners of the room as though unwilling to release their grip. She felt Alistair beside her before she saw him, felt the shift in the air, the quiet force of his presence, and when she turned, he was watching her with an intensity so unguarded it made her heart flutter and ache at once. "It is over," he said softly, though a tremor in his voice betrayed that some part of him still braced for the next blow. She nodded, but her fingers twisted in her skirts, her mind spinning with fear and relief, guilt and longing, hope so fragile it felt almost forbidden. Alistair moved closer, his hand lifting as though to touch her cheek, but he stopped midway, uncertainty flickering across his features despite the victory they had just won. "Celia," he began, and the sound of her name, low, reverent, burdened with emotion he had kept buried for far too long, unraveled something deep within her. She stepped toward him without thinking, drawn by the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the lingering fear that even now she might slip beyond his reach. "You should not look at me with such worry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am here. I am safe." His breath left him in a quiet, fractured exhale. "You nearly weren't," he replied, each word weighted with the memory of her frozen body in his arms. "I keep seeing you in that chapel, cold, pale, slipping away from me." Celia felt her throat tighten. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was sparing you from scandal, from ruin." For a moment Alistair closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as though the struggle within him were too painful to bear. "I do not fear scandal," he said at last, voice husky with emotion. "What I fear, what I barely survived once, is losing someone I—" He stopped, the words catching, the truth trembling on the edge of release. Celia's breath caught as she waited, hardly daring to move. "Someone you— What?" she murmured, the question a single fragile thread between them. His gaze opened to hers again, darker now, unshielded, full of the storms and wounds and longings he had carried alone. "Someone I care for," he whispered. "More deeply than is wise, more deeply than I ever expected to again." Her pulse stumbled into a fluttering rhythm, warmth flooding her chest so swiftly she pressed a hand there to steady herself. "Alistair," she breathed, her knees weakening with the force of how desperately she had longed to hear those words, how often she had silenced her own heart for fear of imagining too much. He reached for her then, slowly, as though approaching something sacred, and this time his hand found her cheek, his thumb brushing the faint trace of tears she hadn't realized had gathered. "When you left," he said, voice low and trembling, "something inside me broke. I rode into that storm with one thought, only one. I could not lose you, not to fear, not to him, not to anything." Celia leaned into his touch, her tears falling freely now, the release of months, years, of loneliness and longing melting beneath his tenderness. "You will not lose me," she whispered, "not unless you send me away yourself." At that, something inside him seemed to crack open entirely. His other hand rose to cradle her face, and he bowed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her lips, as though he hovered at the edge of a confession that could change both their lives. "Celia Harroway," he murmured, each syllable reverent, "you are the first light I have seen in years. You walked into my home with quiet strength and tore down walls I believed immovable. You faced your fears, faced mine, faced Hawthorne, and never once faltered. You have shown me courage I did not know how to claim. And now," his voice shook, the emotion in it so fierce, so earnest, she could scarcely breathe. "Now I cannot imagine a future in which you do not stand beside me." Her heart expanded painfully, wondrously, until she feared it might burst from the sheer magnitude of loving and being loved by him. She lifted her hand to cover one of his, her fingers trembling as they intertwined. "I never expected anything from life," she whispered, "but then you asked for my trust. And I find I cannot give you anything less than my whole heart." His breath shuddered, and he pulled her into an embrace that felt both desperate and tender, the kind of embrace that spoke of a man who had lived too long in winter and had finally found warmth again. She melted into him, her cheek pressed against his chest, hearing the wild, uneven rhythm of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. Time stretched around them, soft and endless, until he finally drew back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers for permission he already felt in every trembling breath. "If I asked you," he whispered, "not out of duty or protection, but out of choice, would you remain here? With me?" Celia's answer rose from the deepest place within her, steady and bright. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Alistair, I would stay." And in that moment, something inside Blackthorn Hall shifted, as though the old walls, long shadowed by grief, recognized the beginning of a new chapter, one not defined by loss, but by a love fierce enough to thaw even the coldest of winters. Spring arrived early at Blackthorn Hall, as though the world itself hurried to mirror the quiet transformation unfolding within its walls, and Celia stood with Alistair on the terrace, overlooking the thawing gardens, her hand resting lightly in his, as morning light warmed the stones beneath their feet. The estate, once shrouded in somber stillness, now hummed with gentle life, buds softening on branches, birds returning to the eaves, servants moving with renewed hope as though the entire household had awakened alongside them. Yet no change felt as profound as the ease in Alistair's posture or the soft steadiness in Celia's breath when she stood at his side. "Are you certain you wish for this?" he asked quietly, though the faint tremor in his voice revealed how deeply he yearned for her answer. Celia turned to him with a smile that rose from her very soul. "I have never been more certain of anything," she whispered, and when his fingers tightened around hers, warmth blossomed through her like sunlight spilling across frost. He drew her closer, his forehead brushing hers, his breath a soft vow against her lips. "Then, from this moment forward," he murmured, "I will spend every day proving worthy of the trust you have given me." Celia's heart swelled, not with fear as it once had, but with peace, with the thrill of a future she had long believed out of reach. "And I," she whispered back, "will walk beside you, not because I must, but because I choose to." In the hush of the new season, with blossoms just beginning to unfurl and the last traces of winter melting into memory, they sealed their promise in a kiss soft as springlight, one that carried not only gratitude and healing, but the tender certainty of a love that had finally, undeniably, found its home.